We're going to be talking about iteration in programming. Generally, iteration is something we associate with arrays, although arrays are not the only objects that we can iterate over. We refer to objects that we can iterate over as iterables in programming. Let's have a look at an array in JavaScript because an array is the most obvious example of an iterable in programming. Now, before we iterate over our array, we're going to define a function that we'll use. The idea with iteration is it means that we're going to apply that function to every single item in the array in order one by one. So let's start with that function. The function's going to be fairly straightforward. We'll call it square. It's going to take in a number and it's just going to return num times num. So basically it's a square function. If we give it the number 5, it's going to return 5 times 5, which is 25. So we can actually use this function to iterate over the array, which we've called myArray. And one of the easiest ways to do this in JavaScript is to make use of a built-in method foreach. Foreach takes a parameter, and it's the name of the function we'd like to use when iterating over the array. In fact, we'll just call this after the function definition, just so it's a bit easier to read. So we've defined an array. We've defined a function called square, which returns the square of the parameter it's given. We've then made use of the foreach method on our array, and each item of that array will be passed to the square function. Now, if we call this, we'll see that it doesn't actually do anything at this stage. So we call this, nothing happens. And you might think for a moment that it's changed the array itself. Let's see if that's the case. We'll console log my array, and we see that nothing's happened to the array. So what's happened here? Well, foreach doesn't actually change the array. There are methods that will change the array. We'll have a look at those a little bit later in this session. But just understand that foreach, all it does is just call that function on each item in the array, but it doesn't change the array itself. Instead of using return num times num, let's console log num times num, because then we'll see some evidence that this is actually working. We're not going to console log my array. Let's now run this. And you can see for each item in the array, we get the square of that number echoed to the output. So 1 squared is 1, 2 squared is 4, 3 squared is 9, etc. So we've iterated over my array and we've called the square function on every item in the array, passing that element of the array as the parameter num when calling the square function. Of course, every time the square function is called, it's console logging the square of that number to the output. Now, what if we wanted to actually change the array? To change the array, we'd use a very similar but slightly different method. Instead of myArray.foreach, we would use myArray.map. And instead of console logging num times num, we'll actually just return the value num times num. So as we iterate through the array, we'll actually change each element in the array based on the return value when the square function is called. Now, you see, this won't happen automatically to myArray. We can prove that. So if we call myArray.map square and then console.log myArray, let's see what we get back here. So you can see we still just get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that's because map doesn't change the array, but the idea is it returns the changed array when it's called. In other words, we can define a new array. Let's call it my new array equals myArray.map. We're passing the square function to that. So if we instead console log my new array, let's see what we get here. We get a new array with the square values included in that array. So to summarize so far, we would call foreach if we just wanted to perform a certain function on each element in the array. We would use map if we wanted to change the array. And after calling .map, the return value from that function is the new changed array, where every element in the array has been iterated over and then changed based on a certain function. Another really common method called on arrays is array.filter. So we'll call myArray.filter. And the idea here is we need to return either true or false from the function. And if you return true, then that item will be kept in the array. If we return false, then the item will be removed from the array. Let's say, for example, that we wanted to remove any item from the array which is not divisible by 2. So let's create a function, and we'll call that function even, because essentially if a number is divisible by 2, it means it's an even number. Let's think about the logic of this function. So this function is going to run num modulo 2 equals 0. In other words, the remainder, when that number is divided by 2, is 0. And we'll actually say equals equals here, and we can return num modulo 2 equals 0. And what will happen here is if the number is even, it's going to return true. If the number is odd, then num modulo 2 is not going to equal exactly 0, so it's going to return false. And we see once again, this doesn't modify the array in place. It doesn't change the original array, but the return value from myArray.filter is going to be the filtered array. So we can test this just by putting them both side by side. So we'll first log out the original array, and we'll see that it's still the same. Then we'll log out my new array, which is basically the original array with .filter called, and then the square function, but we actually want the even function passed to it. Let's run this. So we can see my array is still exactly the same, unmodified at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We can see the return value of calling myArray.filter and passing the even function is 2 and 4, because all of the other elements of the array have been filtered out. Now, this is a fairly condensed line of code. It might be easier just to think about it like this. We could say if num modulo 2. So the code that I'm writing now is going to do exactly the same. It's just a little bit easier to understand. So we'll say if num modulo 2 equals 0, then we can say return true, else return false. But if you just compare, this is obviously a much more concise way of writing the function. The key to understanding this is that this is going to return a Boolean anyway. It's automatically going to return a true or false. This does the same, but it obviously takes up more line of code. So if we just remove the condensed version, rerun this, you see we get exactly the same output. But this is something you'll pick up as you go along. You'll find more and more concise ways of writing the same thing. So when you look at the code of an experienced programmer, in most cases, their code is going to be more concise compared to someone who has just started out coding. So don't worry too much if your code seems to be quite verbose. It takes up quite a number of lines. This is fairly normal. As you gain experience, you'll be able to condense your code. And another way we can do that is even just put it on one line. Obviously, that's purely aesthetic, but you can see it looks like it's taking up a lot less space because everything is just on a single line there. Let's just check everything works. And there we go. We can see the same output.